Keith Warren was described as introverted, a quality that many of us can relate to. But his group of friends and family also recounted that he was confident, happy, charming, and charismatic, and was planning on attending college in a month. The 19-year-old African-American teenager's death in Silver Springs, Maryland, was another seemingly open and shut case. Ruling it as a suicide after only 5 minutes of the investigation was an easy way to stamp the case as solved and move on. Keith's family did initially accept the ruling, but as time went on, they became bewildered with unabated questions because of suspicious circumstances preceding and following Keith's death. Some of the biggest questions were, why were the police so quick to close the case and so reluctant to speak with his mother? Keith Warren was discovered hanging from a tree in the early afternoon of July 31st, 1986. The 911 call came in around 2 p.m. that day. The police assured the coroner that there is no need for him to attend the site of the young man's death, which wasn't given the careful treatment of a typical crime scene. Officers didn't cordon off the area to preserve the location's integrity, and they cut the young man down. And instead of notifying the family of his death or sending the body for an autopsy before burial, Keith Warren's remains were sent directly to a funeral home to be embalmed without so much as a phone call to his mother. In fact, Keith's family was not notified of his death until 7 hours afterward, despite a neighbor giving police his mother's contact information. If not negligent or suspicious, one can easily surmise that the actions of the police were empty-headed. The EMT present on the scene shortly after the body was found speculated that it didn't look like Keith did it to himself and strongly believed foul play was involved. Additionally, 2 ropes were used in his quote-unquote suicide, and the method by which he was hanging was practically impossible because of the small tree. To add to the sinister nature of the case, Keith's body was later exhumed, and an autopsy unearthed drugs in Keith's system that denoted poisoning. Also, Keith Warren had no reason to commit suicide. He was making plans for his future, and no known tragic life events had taken place to cause a shift in his comportment. His friends agreed that he had no suicidal proclivities and wasn't a heavy drug user. Without explanation, Mark Finley, a not-so-good friend of Keith's, was one of the men who was searching for him shortly before the day of his death. Keith's companion, Rodney Kendall, was confounded as to why Mark, who had mostly white friends, was looking for Keith. Keith's sister Sherry also recollected that the last time Mark and Keith had been together, a fight had ensued, and that Mark seemed anxious to find her brother. But although the two of them may have been acquainted, she was positive they were not close. A month after Keith's death, his friend Rodney took Keith's grandmother to the death site to see the tree he was hanged from, only to find that police had cut the tree down. Now saying it was evidence, local authorities collected the tree even though the investigation was closed. To top it off, the tree was discarded after it was cut down, and the majority of the evidence was later destroyed. It certainly wasn't a priority to ensure the integrity of anything taken from the crime scene. The culmination of issues and discrepancies with local authorities compelled Mary to seek answers from anyone but the police, whom she now vehemently distrusted. On what would have been Keith Warren's 25th birthday, April 9th, 1992, his mother Mary received a shocking package that shattered her. This was after she had spent 6 years writing federal agents for help on her son's case to no avail. Upon opening the envelope, she unearthed 5 official crime scene photographs of her dead son's body from the initial police investigation. Authorities did confirm their validity. One could think it was an effort to help her collect more information after looking into the investigation proved fruitless for her, but it's also pretty cruel to provide her with such harrowing images without so much as a warning. Another summation would be someone responsible for the young man's death, or someone with knowledge of it, was rubbing it in the family's faces. But in these shocking photographs, Mary saw the loose-fitting clothing on her son did not belong to him, along with a pair of white sneakers on his feet. Leaves and dirt on Keith's back were indicative that he could have been lying down on the ground before he was hoisted up by somebody to the hanging position. His hands were curled into fists like he was preparing to fight before he passed. Drag marks on the ground suggested somebody pulled his limp body across the forest floor. He was slumped down with his feet extending before him, almost in an L shape because the space between the rope and the ground wasn't far away enough. If he had stood up, he would have stopped suffocating. It was also an engrossing fact because one of the officers that responded to the scene noted that Keith had jumped off a log to aid in his death. When you think of someone trying to hang himself, this isn't the typical fashion in which it would be done. Mary requested the clothing Keith wore in the photographs be returned to her, and she was denied. She only received a jacket and a pair of her son's boots, different from the white sneakers he wore in death. She requested the noose and was given only a piece of rope. When the incident first took place, she wanted to see her son's body before embalming and was denied. It was stated that he was far into horrific stages of decomposition, which is inconsistent with his body being discovered shortly after his death. A note on one of the photographs said, "Don't worry, Mark Finley will be next." If you remember, Mark Finley was one of the boys who was looking for Keith around the time of his death. After the package of photos arrived at Mary's house, Mark learned about the note and contacted Mary, saying he needed to speak with her to, quote, unload, unquote, and get something off his chest. Coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, a month later, Mark died from falling off his bike after colliding with a curb at 2 a.m. in the morning. And if you're thinking that his death sounded suspicious, you are definitely not the only one. Paramedics who arrived at the scene of Mark's death were interviewed and said there were irregularities between the severity of Mark's injuries along with the fall. They specifically noted that his face looked like it was hit with a blunt instrument, most likely a baseball bat. Nearly 8 years after Keith died, his family paid out of pocket for an autopsy to be conducted. A forensic pathologist found in Keith's system high levels of trichloroethylene, otherwise known as TCE, a commonly used cancer-causing solvent that brings about nausea, sleepiness, confusion, unconsciousness, and even death. Moreover, deadly levels of several chemicals were discovered in his system as well. The Maryland Medical Examiner Office tried to assure Keith's family that the compounds were in Keith's system because they were injected into him during the embalming process. But the new forensic pathologist, along with other consummate professionals, noted that these substances were in addition to embalming fluid. They also noted the substances were not through post-mortem injection. The examiner assessed that it was not feasible Keith committed suicide. From the toxicity levels in his system alone, he would have been dead before he even had a chance to tie the rope, let alone hang himself. A few years after Keith's death, law enforcement received a phone call stating that he was drugged at a party with a dosed drink and killed afterward, but it doesn't look like that tip was looked into too deeply. As can be expected, the refusal to accept the ruling of his death as a suicide has left Keith's family on the receiving end of threatening phone calls. I couldn't find the source of the phone calls, so I believe the family never found out who was harassing them either, but I would say it's safe to say the exasperating calls were from people who didn't want anyone to look into Keith Warren's death. People with something to hide. Yes, true crime fascinates most of us, and it's human nature to be interested in mysteries, but this case is more than an unsolved crime. It's downright infuriating. A brazen, unlawful act took place in broad daylight. A teenager died, and no one paid for it except Keith Warren and his relatives. This was not the first black person to be hanged from a tree with claims of it being suicide, and it unfortunately wasn't the last. Mary Cooey passed away in 2009 and fought valiantly for 23 years for answers. She sadly died still holding on to questions brought about by her son's untimely death. Most of us have at least one goal in our lives. We want to be an athlete or a musician, be a writer, have a house, get married, have a boyfriend or girlfriend, travel, have a family, a dog, a cat, have children, etc., etc. But for the rest of Mary Cooey's life, her goal was only to find out what happened to her son. She deserved those answers, and she went to her grave without any, save for the unchanging and erroneous speculation that her son took his own life before he was even old enough to drink a beer. Keith's sister Sherry Warren is still working every day to aid her late mother's search for repose in this sad case. And over 36 years later, her search has yielded no true resolve. It is a fact that people of color are disproportionately swept under the rug when they are missing or murdered, and that needs to change. Every single person deserves the same amount of respect and coverage when they are cruelly and unjustly taken out of this world. And anyone responsible for leaving Keith Warren up in that tree on that summer day in 1986 to die alone deserves to be brought to justice.